Novorossiysk, Russia's main Black Sea naval base, has been hit by Ukrainian drones at least half a dozen times since August of 2023, and each time Russia has answered by bolting on a new layer of defense. On the night of December 14 into December 15, 2025, that defense failed again, in a way it never had before. A Ukrainian underwater drone crossed barges, boom nets, and patrol boats that were supposed to make the inner harbor unreachable, and struck a submarine at its pier. The Institute for the Study of War called it the first confirmed unmanned underwater strike on a submarine in naval history. The submarine, the Kilo-class Kolpino, is now assessed by Britain's Ministry of Defense as likely unable to sail or deploy. This is the story of why a machine that costs a few $100,000 keeps beating a harbor Russia has spent 2 years and multiple defensive layers trying to seal shut. Novorossiysk sits on Russia's Krasnodar coast at the southeastern corner of the Black Sea, a working commercial port with an oil terminal, a grain terminal, and a naval base sharing the same stretch of water. It was not always the Black Sea Fleet's main address. That was Sevastopol, in occupied Crimea, home to the fleet for 2 centuries. Sevastopol fell apart as a safe harbor across 2023, repeated missile and drone strikes on the fleet headquarters, on dry docks, on ships at anchor, made it a place the fleet could be hit, rather than a place it was protected. Satellite imagery from October 1 and October 3, 2023, tracked by the Institute for the Study of War, showed at least 10 vessels moved out of Sevastopol to Novorossiysk in a single week. The frigates Admiral Makarov and Admiral Essen, 3 diesel-electric submarines, 5 landing ships, and several smaller missile ships. Russian commentary called it routine rotation. IS called it a defensive move. Either way, Novorossiysk stopped being a secondary base and became the fleet's last reliable harbor on the Black Sea. That is what makes the port worth defending, and worth attacking. A naval base that can be reached is a naval base that can be neutralized without a single traditional naval battle. Ukraine has no blue water navy to speak of, no carrier, no cruiser, nothing resembling the fleet it is up against. What it has is a domestic drone-building program run largely out of its security service, the SPU, that began with crude, short-range test boats as early as late 2022 and turned Ukraine's naval weakness into a different kind of advantage entirely, uncrewed surface vessels, and, as of December 2025, an uncrewed underwater vessel, each built for a fraction of the cost of anything they are sent to hit. The baseline surface drone in this family, the Sea Baby line, has been priced by its own program head at roughly $300,000 per unit, and by other 2024 reporting closer to $200,000 to $250,000 depending on configuration and exchange rate. Later versions extended the platform's range from about 1,000 kilometers, roughly 620 miles, out to 1,500 kilometers, and increased its payload capacity to as much as 2,000 kilograms, over 4,000 pounds, of cargo or explosive. The submarine it struck in December is estimated by Open Source Defense reporting at $400 million to $500 million. A figure that is not an independently audited replacement cost but gives a rough sense of scale. A drone worth a few $100,000 against a warship worth a few $100 million. That gap is the entire premise of this war at sea, and Novorossiysk is where Russia has tried hardest to close it, not with better ships, but with concrete, steel, and rope. Start with what Russia actually built to stop this. After the first serious drone strike inside Novorossiysk harbor in August 2023, Russian forces installed floating barges across the harbor entrance, a physical barrier meant to block surface drones from reaching the inner bay at all. Over the following 2 years, that barrier grew. Patrol boats of the Krakenok class, a small harbor defense vessel built specifically to intercept fast surface targets close to shore, a seabed warfare vessel called the Ladoga, fitted with anti-drone netting and cages, static sensors watching the approaches, and eventually, after the December 2025 strike, a second boom barrier inside the bay itself, built specifically around the submarine pier. Elsewhere in the Black Sea Fleet, the same period saw Russian crews welding improvised cope cages onto the decks and sails of Kilo-class submarines, metal grating meant to physically deflect a drone's impact or trigger its warhead early, before it can reach the hull itself. On paper, that is 5 or 6 overlapping layers between open water and a docked warship. In practice, every one of those layers has the same structural flaw. It was built to answer the last attack, not the next one. The first layer, the barges at the harbor mouth, illustrates the problem cleanly. A barge barrier is not a wall, it is a gate, and a working commercial port cannot keep its gate shut all the time. Oil tankers, grain carriers, and Russia's own warships still need to move in and out of Novorossiysk, so the barrier has to open, on a schedule outsiders can watch for. Defense analysts studying satellite imagery of the port describe those openings as windows of vulnerability, and note that a small, low-profile craft timed to one of those windows, or one that goes under the barrier rather than through it, does not have to defeat the barge at all. It just has to wait for the door. The second layer is about what the sensors are actually tuned to detect. Radar, patrol boat lookouts, and harbor sonar arrays are built around a certain size and profile of threat. A torpedo, a full-sized submarine, a small boat with a metal hull and a heat signature. Ukraine's surface drone line is built from composite materials specifically to sit below that profile. Operators involved in the program have described the hull as close to invisible on marine radar, a claim that should be read as the manufacturer's own characterization rather than an independently verified spec. But the pattern of successful strikes backs up the general idea. Something that size and that material does not paint the way a warship expects an intruder to paint. Think of it the way a home security system built to catch someone climbing through a window does nothing at all if the intruder walks in through a door nobody thought to wire, because nobody expected the door to be a way in. The third layer, the one that failed most dramatically in December 2025, is depth. Every defense Novorossiysk had built by that point was tuned to the surface: nets that ride on the waterline, barges that float, patrol boats that watch the water's surface and just beneath it. The underwater drone that reached the Kolpino was, according to open-source defense analysis, purpose-built to go past exactly that kind of defense. Under the net's typical draft past patrol craft designed to intercept something moving on the surface, and up to a pre-selected target sitting at the pier. Ukraine's own security service has kept the technical details of the underwater platform deliberately unpublicized, which is itself informative. A defense stack advertises its shape by what it fails to stop, and a harbor with 5 surface-facing layers and nothing built to watch the bottom of the bay has, in effect, one wide-open lane running the entire length of its own blind spot. There is a fourth mechanism at work here, less visible than barges or nets, and it is economic rather than physical. Every layer Russia adds to Novorossiysk is fixed infrastructure: concrete, steel cable, moored barges, a boom that has to be built, anchored, inspected, and maintained in salt water, at a port that also has to keep functioning as a working commercial harbor. None of it can be repositioned quickly if the next attack comes from an angle the layer wasn't built for. Ukraine's side of that equation is the opposite. A drone hull that gets caught by a new sensor or a new barrier does not need the entire program redesigned. It needs one variant changed, at a unit cost low enough that losing several of them in testing or in a failed run is an acceptable price for the information it buys. That is the same logic that let the surface line evolve from a short-range test boat in 2022 into a long-range, heavy payload strike platform by 2024, and then let the SPU field an entirely new underwater variant in 2025 without warning. The defender is paying to harden one location forever. The attacker is paying, in comparison, almost nothing to find the next way in. The pattern is visible across 3 years of strikes on this one harbor, each one a documented case, each one prompting a documented, and each time insufficient, Russian response. On August 4, 2023, a Ukrainian sea drone carrying roughly 450 kilograms, about 990 pounds, of explosives struck the Rapucha-class landing ship Olenigorsky Gornyak inside Novorossiysk harbor. Ukrainian intelligence sources described a serious breach. The ship was photographed listing 40 to 50 degrees to port and had to be towed. Russia's defense ministry claimed 2 drones were repelled outside the base and destroyed. Oryx, the open-source tracker that only logs a loss once it has photographic or video confirmation, visually confirmed the strike and the damage. That is the pattern worth remembering for the rest of this story. Russian officials minimize in public, and the visual record settles it. The Gornyak was towed to occupied Crimea for repair as late as the following year. Ukrainian military intelligence assessed that Russia would not be able to restore it to combat readiness in the near term. A claim from an interested party that should be labeled as such, though even Russian state media reporting on the repair work has been vague about when or whether the ship returns to full service. Russia's answer to that strike was the barge barrier described a moment ago, installed at the harbor mouth within weeks. It held, more or less, through 2024, a year in which Ukraine's surface drones did their damage elsewhere on the Black Sea instead. In February 2024, a swarm of Ukraine's Magura line drones, a related but separate strike boat design, sank the Tarantul-class missile corvette Ivanovets near Lake Donuslav on the Crimean coast, the first time in naval history a warship had been sunk by uncrewed surface vessels alone. The following month, the same drone family struck the Rapucha-class landing ship Cesar Kunikov off Crimea. Neither strike happened inside Novorossiysk's barrier, which is itself the point. The barge kept the harbor's mouth closed to that specific threat, so Ukraine's drones simply kept doing damage everywhere the barrier didn't reach. By the count kept by Oryx, which requires visual confirmation before it will log a loss, Russia's Black Sea Fleet had lost or had damaged 21 warships and 1 submarine by the end of 2025. Ukraine's own general staff claims a higher count, 24 ships and 1 submarine. A gap you should expect between a verified tally and a wartime government's own count. If you've made it this far, the level of sourcing in a story like this is exactly why this channel exists. One figure verified against another, never taken on a single side's word, and if that's useful to you, subscribing costs nothing and helps more of these get made. Novorossiysk itself came back under direct pressure in the back half of 2025. On November 14, a strike on the Caspian Pipeline Consortium's terminal at the port reportedly drew a direct warning from the United States government against hitting Russian oil infrastructure tied to American economic interests, a sign of how far this campaign had started to reach beyond the purely military target set. 11 days later, on November 25, further strikes reportedly damaged the port's Sheskaris oil loading terminal, struck S-300 and S-400 air defense positions guarding the base, and hit a large Russian landing ship, according to open-source reporting on the strikes. Then came December 15, the underwater strike on the Kolpino, the one this video opened with. Satellite radar and optical imagery reviewed by defense analysts in the days after showed a crater roughly 9 meters, about 30 feet, wide in the concrete of the pier itself, and signs consistent with flooding in the submarine's internal compartments. Oryx visually confirmed the strike. The Institute for the Study of War logged it as the first confirmed unmanned underwater vehicle strike on a submarine in the history of naval warfare. Full stop. Not just this war. Russian channels offered only vague acknowledgement and, in some cases, suggested the damage was repairable. That specific claim remains unverified and is presented here only as the Russian side position, not as fact. What is corroborated by a government source outside the war itself is Britain's Ministry of Defense assessment that the submarine is likely unable to sail or deploy. Within 6 days, satellite imagery showed Russia had already installed a second boom barrier, this one inside the inner bay, wrapped specifically around the submarine pier, a second defensive layer built, like the first, only after the layer before it had already failed. The campaign did not stop there. In early March 2026, Ukraine's security service, working with its Alpha Special Operations Center, struck warships, air defense systems, and oil infrastructure at Novorossiysk again. In June 2026, drones set fire to an oil depot at the same port. 3 years in, the harbor has grown barges, nets, cages, patrol boats, and a second boom line, and it is still getting hit. The principle underneath all of this is not really about Novorossiysk, and it is not really about drones. It is about what happens when a defense is built to answer the last attack instead of the next one. Every layer Russia has added to this harbor, the barges, the nets, the cages, the second boom, was a direct, specific, and reasonable response to a strike that had already succeeded. None of them anticipated the strike that came after. A defense built that way does not close the gap between the attacker's cost and the defender's cost. It just adds a new item to the list of things the next drone has to be slightly different from. 3 things are worth watching from here. First, whether Russia adds a genuinely anticipatory layer, something built to catch a category of threat that has not shown up yet, rather than another patch over the last one. Because everything installed at Novorossiysk so far, the barges, the netting, the cope cages, the second boom has been reactive, arriving only after a specific attack had already succeeded. Second, whether Ukraine's security service says anything more about the underwater platform that hit the Kolpino, since right now its capabilities are inferred entirely from what it managed to get past, rather than from anything Ukraine has confirmed on the record. Third, whether Russia decides a harbor it has already had to double wall once is worth defending a third time, or whether the fleet's next move is a further retreat, a question some defense analysts have already started raising about the Caspian, which would mean conceding the Black Sea in practice even while formally keeping a fleet on its books. None of this is a story about one side being clever and the other being careless. It is a story about geography meeting economics, a fixed target that cannot move, and an attacker whose tools get cheaper and stranger every year. Novorossiysk is not the last time this exact problem shows up in this war. It is just the clearest place to watch it happen in real time. Next time, the machine itself is worth a closer look, the one that found a way under the water when everything above it had already been sealed.